All right, we're back, and we're going to talk about how this budget process actually works for the United States government. So, about a year and a half before the fiscal year starts, and remember the fiscal year starts October 1st, not January 1st. About a year and a half before that, each agency will come up with a budget for that fiscal year, so they really have to predict into the future, and send it to the Office of Management and Budget. The Office of Management and Budget and the president get together, with the president's advisors and the fiscal, there's lots of people that work for the president that look at nothing but the federal budget. They get together, they edit things here and there, they combine it all into one big document, and then about 8 months before the fiscal year starts, they send it to Congress. And that's called the President's Budget Request. And the President's Budget Request has a huge amount of power over what actually gets implemented. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But when Congress gets this budget request, they divide it up. So one of the committees that both the House and the Senate has is called the Appropriations Committee. So we talked earlier about how Congress is divided up into lots of different committees. There's Judiciary and Health and Human Services and a whole bunch of other different committees in both the House and the Senate. Each chamber of the Congress, both the House and the Senate, have an Appropriations Committee. And each one of those Appropriations Committees has different subcommittees with focuses on different aspects of the federal budget. So when Congress receives this presidential budget request, they divide it up into 12 sections and send each section to the appropriate subcommittee within the Appropriations Committee. Then those subcommittees, they start kind of going at the budget, and they make, again, relatively minor changes, sometimes major changes, but mostly it's relatively minor changes. They hold hearings. Usually they'll call in people from that agency and say, hey, why do you want all this money? What program is this paying for? Why is that good value for the taxpayer? And those agency representatives have to kind of justify why they want this amount of money for this program or that program. There's a lot of bargaining that goes on in this stage, right? So these subcommittee members on the appropriations subcommittees, especially cross-party, they get to say, well, my party really wants this program, your party really wants that program, so how can we kind of come to an agreement about this specific chunk of the budget that our particular subcommittee has power over? And they, go through their little bargaining process of increasing that and decreasing that, and let's get rid of this program, but let's beef up this program. And then finally, they get to an agreement on their particular chunk of that budget, and they vote on it. And once it passes, it goes back to the full Appropriations Committee, which again is a small subsection of the House of Representatives. And then the full Appropriations Committee has to kind of do this all over, but there's not usually a lot of change here. If change is going to happen in Congress, it's going to be at that subcommittee level. The Appropriations Committee usually just kind of accepts what the subcommittees have done, sometimes with minor changes, but not usually really big changes, not a lot of even minor changes. And then the full Appropriations Committee has to pass the full budget. Right? They've now combined the 12 subcommittees into one big budget again, and they have to vote and pass for the full budget. Then it goes to the full House of Representatives, and now the entire House has to pass it. But once again, they usually take the recommendations of the Appropriations Committee. There's usually not a lot of changes that happens between passing it by the Appropriations Committee and passing by the full House. But once it passes the House, it goes to the Senate. And a lot of this happens kind of at the same time. A lot of it has to happen in the House first. But a lot of it is kind of going on concurrently in the Senate. And they have their Appropriations Committee and they have their Appropriations Subcommittees. And then the Senate will pass it via their subcommittees and then pass it with the full Appropriations Committee and then pass it with the full Senate. And these are never exactly the same as the budget that was passed by the full House. So now the Senate has to pick a few representatives and the House has to pick a few representatives to meet together for the conflict resolution process, where they take the differences between the version of the budget that passed the full House and the version that passed the full Senate and figure out, okay, how do we resolve these differences? Because we have to have both the full House and the full Senate passing the exact same thing before it can actually become law. So they work out their differences. There's a little bit more bargaining here. The Senate wants, $10 billion for this agency. The House wants $8 billion. So they will usually, kind of agree on 9 or some form of bargaining and give and take here. But they'll eventually come to a resolution of the differences between the House version and the Senate version. Then it has to repass the full House and the full Senate in the exact same language. And once both houses have passed the budget with the exact same language, then it goes to the president. And the president will almost always sign a budget. But sometimes the president has the option, well, they always have the option, sometimes they actually utilize the option of vetoing the budget, just like they have the power to veto any law passed by Congress. This is incredibly rare with an actual budget for a few reasons. But what is more common is the president using just the threat of a veto to influence that congressional budgetary process. If the president says, I promise that I'm going to veto any budget that has this program in it because I really hate that program and I don't want that program to happen. So if you send me a budget with that program getting money, I'm going to veto it. That can influence how Congress creates and modifies that budget. On the other hand, it can go in the other direction too, right? Because presidents are so reluctant to veto this big, giant budget that took like a year and a half to create, Congress can do things that the president really doesn't like because they know they're super reluctant to use that veto power. So Congress will often put in programs that they know the president doesn't like just because they think, well, the president will have to sign this budget even with this program they don't like, because they really don't want to veto the whole thing. And that's the only option that the president really has. The president has to kind of take it or leave it. They can't change it once it's been passed by Congress. All they can do is say yes or no, right? So Congress will often put in things that they couldn't pass by themselves into this giant budget because they know presidents really don't want to veto it. In some states, governors have what's called the power of the line item veto, right? So in those states, governors can say, look, I'm not going to veto this whole bill, whether it's the state budget or any other law that's passed by their state Congress. I'm just going to veto this small part of it, this piece of it, right? That's called the line item veto. And at the federal level, the president doesn't have that power. There was a law passed, I think, in the late 90s to give the president that power of the line item veto. It did not work out very well, and it ended very soon after. So for 99.9% of the country's history, the president has just had to say yes or no to the entire thing. They don't have the power to veto just kind of small sections of it, right? And again, the president has that power to veto the budget just like any other law, but they're reluctant to use it because it's been worked on for so long by so many different agencies. They've had huge amounts of money and time and effort put into this thing. And a veto would be really difficult to justify and to kind of make up for. And we need a budget, right? We need money to operate the United States government. Now, there's a whole bunch of kind of bargaining and give and take and changes that Congress makes. But the final budget that's actually passed by Congress and signed into law by the president has never differed significantly than the president's original budget request, right? So the total numbers, the total spending package is always within a couple percent and very low couple percent of what was originally suggested. So if the president puts out a budget for, $900 billion, even after Congress changes and modifies and adds and subtracts and does all this stuff, that final budget is probably going to be, anywhere between $895 and $905 billion. So there's 1 or 2 percentage points is a pretty major shift when looking at the difference between that original presidential budget request and what's eventually passed by Congress. Now, small details might have changed a lot, right? So in the president's budget request, he could have requested $50 billion for this program or this agency, and that might get $10 billion by the time it comes out on the end. But that $40 billion saved that Congress cut from that agency or program is going to be spent over in another agency or program. But the total dollar amount for the whole thing rarely changes very much at all. 1 or 2%, right? Now, what happens if we can't pass a budget? This has happened a few times and is happening more and more and more often. Without a budget, the government can't operate, right? As soon as October 1st starts, if a budget's not there, the government doesn't have any money. It can't pay its employees. It can't operate programs. It can't send out Social Security checks. It can't pay the military. So usually what will happen is, there's some disagreement between Republicans and Democrats in Congress about this part of the budget or that part of the budget. We're not going to get it done on time. So what they usually do is pass what's called a continuing resolution. And a continuing resolution just basically says, hey, the budget you had for last month, continue with another month of that, or another 2 months of that, or another 3 months of that, while we finish up this budget, and then we can actually, have a full budget for the year. That now, because of this continuing resolution, now that budget's only going to last, say, 11 months instead of the full 12, but because we used 1 month of a continuing resolution, which just essentially extended the budget from last year. And these continuing resolutions are becoming more and more and more common. In fact, there's at least once or twice where an entire year didn't actually get a budget. It just had an extra 12 months of continuing resolutions, and the budget kind of for that year never got passed. The government operated for an entire year on just continuing resolutions. Now, if Congress can't even agree on a continuing resolution, then we get a government shutdown. Government runs out of money, the budget has expired, and we have not only new budget to take its place, but no continuing resolution to continue. The government shuts down. And here's a chart, as you can see on the slide here. That is a chart, a list of every single time the government has shut down. And if you'll notice, even the first one wasn't until 1980, so relatively recently. And the other thing is that these shutdowns usually, in the vast majority of cases, don't last very long, right? In some cases, only a couple hours. In other cases, 1, 2, 3 days, right? So there have only been kind of 3 government shutdowns that lasted more than, 1, 2, 3, a single digits number of days. And all of those have been in the last 30 years. There are lots of reasons for why these, not only can Congress not agree on a budget, but they also can't agree on a continuing resolution. And each time it happens, there's slightly different rules about, maybe Social Security payments still do go out. Maybe this group will still continue to get paid. But it's always kind of iffy and scary for federal employees because they don't know if they're getting a paycheck. They don't know if they have health insurance, right? All these problems. So government's actually shutting down is very rare. And the majority of times when it has happened, it's a very short government shutdown. And it's only lasted more than a tiny handful of days 3 times, right? All right, we're going to go ahead and take another break. Thank you for watching.